Manhattan Neighborhood Network, in partnership with the League of Women Voters of New York, Gotham Gazette, and the New York Amsterdam News, is pleased to welcome you to a debate between two of the candidates running for New York City Comptroller. The Comptroller is the chief financial officer for the city, overseeing an $85 billion budget. They monitor the spending of the City Council and the Mayor, and are also tasked with the auditing of city agencies and managing the city's pension funds. I'm Elinor Tatum, publisher and editor-in-chief of the New York Amsterdam News. New York City's general election is Tuesday, November 7th. The winners will take office in January. The candidates joining us today are Alex Merced, the Libertarian candidate, and Julia Willebrand, the Green Party candidate. Thank you both for being here. We're going to start with you, Alex. You're running to be the Chief Financial Officer of New York City. What is your professional experience for one that gives you the expertise to work with an $85 billion budget?
Now, I've been working in the financial industry for the last decade, and basically it's been on the actual industry side, but also in financial training. So I've built relationships with portfolio managers, with financial planners, and teaching them a lot of the concepts that are needed to make sure we protect people's assets. I train people on how do you manage things like political risk, how do you manage inflation risk, and these are all things that are tidewinds to the pensions of everybody's retirement, whether you're a police officer, a teacher, or a firefighter. And you need a comptroller who can ask the questions. So while you'll have a team to help you put these things together, you need someone who's the leader, who's the top of the food chain, who can ask the questions to make sure everybody is trying to address all the problems that can face a portfolio to protect the retirements. My big thing is all about risk and all about being able to manage the risk so that way people's retirements are funded, protected, and secure, and taxpayers are protected from catch-up payments that are unforeseen, that distract funds from things that they do care about, like more schools, more parks, more services for the people of the city of New York. So that way everyone's protected. And I want to take my years of being in the financial industry, training, again, financial planners, portfolio managers, people who are involved in managing pension funds, people who actually have served as a comptroller in the past, to the people of New York City.
And Julia, you're running for the comptroller as well. And what is your professional experience that gives you the expertise?
My professional experience is, in essence, my life as an activist. I've been an activist for 60 years. And as an activist and a Green Party activist, I want the city to change. I want it to become more just. I want it to become more environmentally intelligent. And those changes, the comptroller could, in fact, affect some of those changes. Now, the comptroller, in theory, is the city's bookkeeper, if you will, but the comptroller has the power of the audit. And with the power of the audit, the comptroller can make major changes. And what I would want to do is use the audit power to produce the numbers to change the way people see what the city is doing. For instance, when I'm the comptroller, I will do the audit to find out exactly how many dollars is New York City handing out to developers for how much housing. The dollars that they're getting is in tax abatements. In other words, they're not paying taxes and they're having all the services for free. That's a subsidy. It's a corporate subsidy. And as a Green, I would like to change that corporate subsidization into something that's good for the city. And the way I would do that is by informing the public, the city, of how their money is being, the distortion involved in handing it out to billionaire developers as opposed to providing services for the people of New York City.
This is going to lead very well into the next question that I'm going to ask. And what, in your opinion, is the city government's biggest waste of money, and how would you fix it, Julia?
The biggest waste of money, among other things, is $85 billion being funneled through private banks, and they are taking a cut of every single dollar in our budget. And we should not be wasting our money by funneling that $85 billion through private banks. New York City needs its own public bank. Then all of that wasted money would remain in the city's budget to be used for the things we do need to use it for instance, subway improvements.
All right, thank you. Alex, what do you believe the city government's biggest waste of money, and how would you fix it?
The biggest thing that I want to fix right now is the pension system. Because if you take a look at the report that came out in 2016, we returned a little bit over 1% in the pension funds of New York City, when it's assumed that it's going to return 7% each year. Falling behind like this has resulted in almost $1 billion of catch-up payments to New York City taxpayers over the next several years. That's money that's not going to schools, money that's not going to repair streets, not going to help the subway run any better. That's things that could help improve the quality of life of everyone because of the returns on the pensions. And basically the way you fix that, it's not just by throwing more money at it, because then the structure of the pension is still the same. That's why I've been discussing that assumed rate of return, 7%. I want to start the conversation to lower that to 5%, so that way we can lower the overall risk structure of the pensions portfolios. And at the end of the day, they'll be funded on a much more sustainable level in the long term that'll protect taxpayers and protect people's retirements and free up funds that can be used for a lot of the things that New York City people care about.
So that wouldn't just protect the funds, but would that actually grow the funds as well?
It would over time, because basically what would happen is that right now, since you're assuming a 7% return, we're putting in less money up front, and it's not even achieving those 7% returns. So that means we have to put a lot more money on the back end. While if we lowered it to a 5% return, we put in a little bit more money up front, but that would result in us having to put a lot less money in the long run, because you have a more predictable return that you can achieve by taking less risk. So that means less catch-up payments, and that means those funds get freed up in the future to prevent, so that we don't have those unforeseen catch-up payments.
All right, Julia, the Comptroller's office, they protect the retirement funds and the pension funds for school teachers, the firefighters, and the city workers. How would you seek to just protect them, or would you seek to grow them and improve on the returns? And if so, how would you do it?
I would seek to do both, protect it and grow it. And I had the experience as comptroller candidate in 2006 of proposing that the New York City Pension Fund be administered in a socially just way. And I used as an example of how successful that possibility of doing your investing in the context of principles and so forth, that Norway happens to have one of the the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. And I suggested in 2006 that New York follow the model of Norway, which invests in multiple ways. However, it disinvests and uses the fund money to enhance the socially just world. And for instance, Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund disinvested from Walmart because of Walmart's human rights violations. This year, Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund has assets of $1 trillion. That's 12 zeros. That $1 trillion assets grew from 2006, when I proposed us following their model, from about 300 billion. So it's tripled its value in the last 10 years. That also would allow us to, New York City, to become, since we're the owners of billions of dollars in assets, we could do what the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund does, which is direct, act as owners. We are owners, and in fact involve ourselves in how the assets are being created by the companies we're investing in.
Thank you. Have you been active in the capital markets, Alex?
Me personally, yeah. I work in the financial industry, so personally I do some investments on my, whether they be in equities. I also participate in the blockchain environment, looking into things like Bitcoin, Litecoin. I'm very big on anything finance, especially peer-to-peer finance, because it does lower the transaction costs. And that goes back to what Julia was talking about, going through, having everything financially go through large institutions does have a cost to it. And in the past, technology was in a way where you couldn't really get around that cost because you needed those large institutions. Things like blockchain technology really open up the door to have a much lower transaction costs, which could lower the cost of doing financial transactions and delivering services for New York City, doing all sorts of things for New York City that could save taxpayers money, again, that could either be used to give it back to them or to use for services to improve services that New York City people want. So I want to explore technology as comptroller to see how that technology can be used to reduce the cost of New York City. And in those markets, I participate so that way I can understand it better and how it can benefit people.
Julia, have you been active in capital markets?
Personally, I have not been active in capital markets. However, I do have an investment fund, actually left over from a pension fund, and I have someone that takes care of it because I personally do not want to be involved in the investment aspect of it. However, I am also very active in Occupy, and Occupy continues to have a group within the movement called Alternative Banking, and we meet every single Sunday up at Columbia. And basically what we do there is look at how banks, which are in fact running the country more or less, deal with money. And we publicly rally. For instance, we, over a couple of years, have more than once engaged with Jamie Dimon in front of his house.
There has been an increase in the city payroll by 20%. Do you believe this spending is in line, Julia?
First of all, those city employees are workers, and they are entitled to increases in salaries, et cetera. The average worker in the United States has not had a wage increase since 1973. So I do not disapprove of our staff, our city employees getting more money. They're entitled to it, so is everybody. What I do think is that it might possibly be spent in different ways. For instance, New York City police force, 40,000 policemen. 40,000 policemen, some major percentage of them, and if I were the comptroller, I would get the numbers on the New York City police. How many of those policemen are in fact engaged in handing out parking violations or traffic violations, fare beaters in the subway? That's an inappropriate job for a policeman who has a gun. They're supposedly there to protect us, and doing mostly what they do, which is hand out summonses, is a waste of our money. I don't say get rid of the police. I said let them do more serious work and give that kind of work, summons issuing, to other parts of the staff that are not trained as are police.
Alex, same question.
I have no problem with what you have to spend. If you hire someone, you have to pay them. And there's nothing wrong with getting a raise in pay. But if payrolls are increasing, it's because people are expecting the government of New York City to do more. Or it needs to do more based on current policy. The question is, do we really need it to do everything that it is doing? And I think as comptroller, it's about highlighting priorities. For example, Julia highlighted a good one when it comes to the police, as far as what are we using our police force to do? Are we using it to prevent murder, rape, theft, or are we using it to essentially sometimes harass people to generate revenue, whether through parking tickets or through traffic violations, et cetera? Now, so prioritizing different areas of New York City government, we can figure out what we need to do and maybe reduce some of those costs, because those costs do get funded by taxes. And I mean, property taxes haven't gotten any lighter for the people of New York City, and it's making it harder for people who, basically the middle class of New York, to exist. Because if you're someone who's already fully paid for your home in New York City, as property taxes go up, people are struggling to keep up with that growing assessment on their property and are being forced to sell their homes, and thus you end up having huge blocks of land ending up in the hands of developers, who then cause a lot of the redeveloping and rezoning that people have issues with. So tackling some of those issues so that way we can prioritize how New York spends its money and where New York needs to hire, which can be done through the audit power of the comptroller, can help us address that issue. But at the end of the day, what you pay is what you got to pay.
In that same vein, Mr. Stringer, the current controller, has said that the city spends $2.4 billion on homeless services. Is the city getting a return on that spending, Alex?
Well, you have a couple problems, because what happens is with the way our homeless program works is that, let's say you're a hotel and we use your hotel, a lot of hotels end up being used as shelters. But then what happens is that hotel gets exempt from property tax. So basically the policy continues to grow in cost, but then actually decreases the revenue that it generates for New York City, which means property taxes grow even faster for everybody else, which means more people can't afford where they live and end up in shelters. So it ends up kind of cannibalizing itself under its current structure. There does need to be a policy to help us address the homeless issue and make sure that people can afford to live in New York City. But we need to take the approach of empowerment to make it easier for people to be able to empower themselves and have opportunities, instead of increasing the costs everywhere where opportunities begin to disappear and more people need more aid, which ends up, again, having that weird vicious cycle that I mentioned before.
Julia, slightly different question.
I'd like to answer that one.
Oh, okay.
The city's investment in homeless services could, yes, be better spent elsewhere. Where it could be spent is in providing the homeless with housing. And one of the things the city could do, and it's being done all over the world, is use mobile homes, use RVs to house them. The city has pieces of property all over the city, parking lots, et cetera, and the cost of the RVs and the mobile homes would be minimal compared to what they're spending to provide corporations, yet again with subsidies, i.e. corporations that own hotels. So there are other solutions to what's happening in the city other than run it the way it's always been run. But one of the buts is that obviously the controller doesn't have the power to directly do these things, but the controller has the power of the public pulpit, if you will, and the bully pulpit, meaning that he can or she can tell the New York voter how their money is being spent and what better ways there would be to spend it. It could do that by analyzing and coming up with the numbers and making those numbers public. And that's I think the biggest piece of what the controller could do is to become the public information officer about how our money is being spent. And by the way, we do have in New York City a commissioner of information I discovered. Her name is Mary Rose. So the controller could start interacting with the commissioner of information to give the New York City citizens the information to know how our city could be run better.
All right, thank you. Julia, what do you think of the New York City, the Land Bank program?
Affordable housing in New York City could be developed, and one of the ways, major ways it could be developed is using the air rights. The city of New York has 1,000 public schools. All of those schools are generally a half a block in area, and those 1,000 public schools all have air rights. The problem with affordable housing in New York City is what the land costs are. That's ostensibly why we have so much trouble with affordable housing. Also, of course, corporations, subsidies and so forth. So if we use the air rights the way, for instance, Trinity, a very, very fancy private school in Manhattan, used its air rights to build luxury housing, and that luxury housing enabled them to, the money that came from it enabled them to redesign their own school and so forth. And then the YMCA on 63rd Street used its air rights to have luxury development and used the money it got from the developers for the air rights to refurbish the gym and so forth in it. So New York City has 1,000 public schools, all of which have air over them that could be, in fact, used to build housing.
Thank you. Alex, what do you think of the Land Bank program?
Now, as far as the land, that's one way to provide more housing. But at the end of the day, if we want to make housing affordable, we need to make life affordable in New York City. And we need to address all costs. So I'm fine that there's land set aside to create affordable housing. The question is, what is the process for deciding who gets it, and what are the hoops they have to jump through? Because oftentimes that's where a lot of the corruption lies, is in the devil's in the details. And that's the kind of thing that a comptroller needs to make sure to audit and find out. But one of the ideas I really love for empowering people is actually the libertarian mayoral candidate, Aaron Comey. He came up with the idea of to empower the people in NYCHA housing by giving them ownership over their unit. So if you own your apartment in that NYCHA housing, we basically give the tenants ownership. They have an asset. Their wealth has just increased, and you've empowered them to improve their life in a new way. And that allows us to then focus on developing another land and then empowering people that way. So I like that idea. But also in shedding transparency, our public advocate candidate, Devin Balkin, has actually already made information more available to New York City people by going to, if you go to projects.votedevin.com, you can see the spending, whether it be related to the land bank or NYCHA housing. But also we need to reduce the cost of living, because that's going to make housing easier to pay for if I'm not spending as much on healthcare, if I'm not spending as much on education. And that's a mix of federal policies, state policies, and New York City policies that can be reformed to make all those things cost less. Because if we just feel that we need to address costs, not by addressing the costs, but by just saying, hey, we're going to spend more money, then the cost will just keep going up and we'll just keep feeling the pinch.
Well, you were just mentioning the ownership of NYCHA. Well, what about the TIL program that's already in existence?
I'm not as familiar with that particular program, but if there's a program, a similar program already in existence, I'm for that. I am for anything to help give them that kind of empowerment. If it gives them ownership over their unit, then I'm for that program.
It was done with the city. The city was their partner in rehabilitating these buildings that were at one point laying fallow. And this is a program that's been going on for the last 40 years in New York.
I would definitely visit the program, make sure people are more aware of the program, and see if there's ways we can improve the program, because that's definitely a kind of program that I approve of.
All right, we are quickly running out of time, so I'm just going to ask a few more quick questions. Julia, what kind of tax cuts or increases would you propose?
I wouldn't propose either a tax cut or an increase. I propose a major change in how the city handles its assets and handles its things. For instance, New York City does not need more automobiles in it. In fact, so the comptroller needs to work on getting the city's congestion pricing in, and that essentially is a tax that I do approve of, because it will reduce the amount of automobiles in it. But the other piece of that is, once you make that your goal, less automobiles in New York City, there are some other things we could do. For instance, public housing in New York City has parking lots attached to the housing. So we are offering those residents benefits, and it would be a good idea if we didn't offer them that benefit, i.e. free parking for their car, because it would discourage them from having cars. So I think that we ought to take the parking lots that are attached to NYCHA housing and use it to, for instance, house the homeless in RVs.
They do have to pay for that parking. It's not very expensive, but they do have to pay for it. What tax cuts or increases would you propose?
I would propose no tax cuts right away, because the bottom line is, if you're going to cut taxes, you got to make sure you can figure out where that spending cuts are going to come from. I'm not here I don't want to increase the debts of New York City either. But what I would like to do, and I think is always a good first place to start that everyone can appreciate, is simplification, because there is a cost to complexity. As rules get more complex, as taxes get more complex, it costs more to comply, and that's money that could be spent in all sorts of quality of life issues, whether it's the cost to you, an accountant, the cost to you and a lawyer to deal with these complexities. That's money that can be spent elsewhere in your life, whether it's paying for your home, paying for your healthcare, paying for your education. So I think we can save people money by making our regulations, our taxes simpler, and then we can tackle the amount of spending, so that way we can tackle the amount of taxation.
All right, and a last question. I'll start with you, Julia, on this. If required, like in the case of an economic downturn in New York City, where would you cut the city budget?
Corporate subsidies, the endless amount of them that are hidden from most people, be a piece of cake to end the nonsense of 421A, of handing developers giant 20-year tax well, essentially subsidies, because they don't have to pay any taxes on the $1 million condos that they sell or build. So that's where I would start.
Alex?
I mean, I 100% agree. Basically, that's generally I guess the best place to start, because but also taking a look at, you always mentioned the consulting fees and whatnot, and I think that's a great place to look for, where there's a lot of ways for basically different departments across the city hire all these external accountants. And that's why I think it does matter that the people who are in office have knowledge about this area, in the sense that I'm the only candidate running for comptroller that has experience in the financial industry, and that means I'll have to hire less consultants, because there's more stuff that I won't necessarily have to ask a whole bunch of consultants to do, because I have that knowledge set. And there you save money when you have people who can do it instead of having to pay twice for the same thing. So I think that's a great thing that you pointed out, and something where I think we are in agreement as far as where you can save a lot of money.
Okay, great. So anything you would like to say in closing, Julia?
That we need to change the comptroller's mission. The comptroller's mission at the moment is to audit agencies in the city and contracts to make sure they meet certain kinds of guidelines. And it's way, way too simple and very wasteful. We have to change the viewpoint of New York City's residents, of New York City voters, and the only way we can change that viewpoint is for them to have information. They don't know the issues, how many, $2.5 billion that New York City paid out last year or in the last few years, to consultants about how we should be investing our money. That if New York City voters knew that, they would do something about it, and the comptroller's job, I believe, should be to be the informant who tells the public what's going on in the city.
Thank you so much. And Alex?
Basically, bottom line is, comptroller is about holding government accountable, so that way it provides the value that New York City voters want. And that's why you want to vote for someone who's not part of the major parties, not a Republican, not a Democrat. So I hope people will look more into me and Julia when they vote on November 7th. But on top of it, the comptroller gets involved in the day-to-day financing of New York and issuing municipal bonds. They sit on the board that makes decisions regarding the pensions of New York City. So that's why you do want someone who has experience in the financial industry, which is the reason why I am running for this, because there wasn't anyone with that experience running for this office. But I also encourage people to learn more about my campaign by going to alexmercedforny.com and learn about the entire citywide slate from the Libertarian Party this year at libertariannyc.com, because we have a lot to offer. We have a lot of ideas, and regardless of what are the outcomes on November 7th, we are here to advocate for the people of New York City and empower them.
Thank you both for joining us today, and good luck to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The general election is on Tuesday, November 7th. For more information about voting, locating your poll site, and all the candidates, you can visit the League of Women Voters website, lwvnyc.org or mnn.org. Thank you for watching Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Have a great day.